ground. Don't breach your... Get on the ground. I'm on the ground. Get on the ground. Stay on the ground. Put your hands behind your back.
It was a cool October night in 1997 when four friends entered a cemetery on the edge of Kansas City. By sunrise, two of them would be dead, one from a bullet to the head, the other from an apparent suicide. The story sounds like the beginning of a ghost tale, but it's not fiction. This is the real-life murder of 18-year-old Anastasia Wittbolsvögen, a case that left her family shattered, her friends divided, and a community asking the same question for decades. Who really killed Anastasia? Was justice truly served, or was the wrong person condemned to spend the rest of his life in prison? Tonight, we take you deep inside one of Missouri's most haunting true crime cases. And once you hear the details, you'll be left wondering what to believe. The autumn air in Kansas City in late October 1997 carried with it the crisp scent of falling leaves and the subtle reminder that winter was just around the corner. For most people, October was a season of Halloween decorations and the last glimpses of warm evenings. But for 18-year-old Anastasia Wittbolsvögen, October would mark the abrupt and violent end of her young life, leaving her family and community with questions that remain unsettling to this day. Anastasia was known to those around her as creative, intelligent, and somewhat eccentric. She was fiercely independent, the kind of teenager who valued her individuality and wasn't afraid to stand out from the crowd. She had a curiosity about life and an intensity in the way she engaged with people. Those who knew her described her as having an artistic spirit, and though she sometimes wrestled with the challenges of adolescence, she was navigating her way into adulthood with a sense of determination. On the evening of October 22, 1997, Anastasia found herself in the company of friends, Justin Bruton, Byron Case, and Kelly Moffat. They were young, restless, and chasing the kind of late-night adventures that seemed both harmless and thrilling at that age. They drove through the streets of Independence, Missouri, their night unfolding without any clear plan other than being together and finding a way to push back against boredom. The group eventually wound up near Mount Washington Cemetery, a place where local teens sometimes went to hang out, test their nerves, and indulge in the mystique of being somewhere forbidden after dark. It was sometime around 7:00 p.m. when they entered the cemetery. The details of what happened there remain clouded in mystery, with versions of the story shifting depending on who was telling it. What is certain is that Anastasia was alive when she was last seen by her companions in that cemetery. By the early hours of the next morning, she would be dead, discovered in Lincoln Cemetery, not far from where she had last been seen alive. Her body was found around 4:00 a.m. on October 23, 1997. The discovery was chilling. Anastasia had been shot in the head. There was no mistaking the violence of her death. No way to imagine that what happened was anything other than intentional. Police arrived at the cemetery and began the grim task of piecing together the final moments of her life. At the same time, tragedy struck in another direction. That same morning, news emerged that Justin Bruton, one of the young people who had been with Anastasia the night before, was dead from an apparent suicide. He had used a revolver to end his life, leaving behind only more questions. The timing was impossible to ignore. Within the span of just a few hours, two young lives had ended, their stories forever intertwined in the minds of investigators and the community. From the very beginning, suspicion lingered. The group of four friends who had been together that night now consisted of only two living witnesses, Byron Case and his then-girlfriend, Kelly Moffat. Both gave statements, but their recollections painted different pictures. Kelly's version would eventually become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case years later, but in 1997, the story remained murky. For Anastasia's family, the shock was unbearable. She had left home with friends, and less than 24 hours later, she was gone. The phone call delivering the news shattered the rhythm of their lives. Parents are never prepared to bury their children, and the violence of Anastasia's death made the grief even sharper. The cemetery where she had died became a symbol of stolen innocence, a place her loved ones would never see the same way again. The police worked to connect the dots, but the case quickly became complicated. Justin's suicide created an immediate assumption in some circles that he may have been responsible for Anastasia's murder before taking his own life. It seemed like a narrative that fit. Two friends, both troubled in their own ways, one killing the other, and then himself in despair. But there were problems with this version. No solid forensic evidence linked Justin to Anastasia's death. The weapon he used on himself was not definitively tied to her killing. And without more clarity, detectives were left with more speculation than certainty. Meanwhile, Byron Case, the other young man who had been with Anastasia that night, emerged as a figure of interest. At the time, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him, but whispers about his possible involvement began to circulate. Case was known for his sharp tongue, his rebellious streak, and his willingness to antagonize authority. To some, he seemed like the type of person who might get drawn into something reckless. To others, he was just another teenager navigating the turbulence of youth. As the months turned into years, Anastasia's murder remained unsolved. Her name faded from newspaper headlines, but not from the hearts of her family, who continued to live with the unanswered question of who had killed their daughter. For them, time did not soften the wound. It only deepened the frustration that no one had been held accountable. It wasn't until 2001, nearly 4 years later, that the case would resurface in a dramatic way. A prosecutor, reviewing old files and witness statements, turned once again to Kelly Moffat, Byron Case's ex-girlfriend. Kelly came forward with testimony that would become pivotal. According to her, Byron had confessed to killing Anastasia. She claimed that in the aftermath of that October night, he had told her the details of how he pulled the trigger. Her account shifted the focus squarely onto Byron and reignited the investigation with a new intensity. For those who had long suspected Byron's involvement, this was the missing piece. For others, it felt like a story that had been shaped and molded under pressure, years after the fact. Regardless, prosecutors believed Kelly's testimony was strong enough to take to trial. Byron was charged with Anastasia's murder in 2001, and the stage was set for a courtroom battle that would not only determine his fate, but also reopen the wounds of a family who had been grieving for nearly half a decade. By the time jury selection began in 2002, emotions were running high. The prosecution presented its case with a clear narrative. Byron Case was the one who pulled the trigger that night, killing Anastasia in cold blood. The defense, however, argued that the state's case was built on flimsy evidence, a single witness whose credibility could be questioned, and a lack of physical proof tying Byron to the murder. For Anastasia's loved ones, sitting in the courtroom was both excruciating and necessary. They listened as their daughter's life was dissected in legal terms. Her last night alive, replayed over and over, her name invoked in arguments and counter-arguments. The young woman they remembered for her laughter and individuality was now reduced to evidence exhibits and testimony. As the trial unfolded, the weight of Kelly Moffat's testimony became clear. Her words were the backbone of the prosecution's argument. Without her account, the state had little else to go on. But with her, they believed they had the credibility to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Whether her testimony was the truth or a fragile recollection shaped by years of distance was the central question. The courtroom in Jackson County buzzed with anticipation in May of 2002. Nearly 5 years had passed since the night Anastasia Whitbulls-Fugen was killed, and now, finally, her case was before a jury. For her family, it was a moment of fragile hope that justice might finally be done. For Byron Case, it was the moment where his future, his freedom, and his very life would be decided by 12 strangers. The prosecution's story was simple yet chilling. Byron Case, they argued, had been the one to pull the trigger that night in October 1990. The key to their narrative lay almost entirely in the testimony of one person, Kelly Moffat, Byron's ex-girlfriend. Years after the murder, Kelly had come forward and claimed that Byron had confessed to her. She told the jury that Byron described shooting Anastasia in the head and leaving her in Lincoln Cemetery to die. The details she gave matched the known facts of the case. and prosecutors insisted that no one but the killer himself could have shared them with her. Kelly's testimony was delivered with a weight that could not be ignored. The courtroom sat as in tense silence as she recalled Byron's alleged confession. Prosecutors reinforced her credibility, suggesting that she had carried the truth in silence for years before finally finding the courage to speak. To them, it was the missing piece that explained what had happened that night and why Anastasia had died. The defense, however, countered sharply. They argued that Kelly's story was unreliable, tainted by the passage of time, and perhaps influenced by outside pressure. Memories, after all, are fragile things, and the defense highlighted inconsistencies between Kelly's earlier statements and her testimony at trial. They pointed out that there was no physical evidence linking Byron to Anastasia's murder. No weapon was recovered, no fingerprints, no DNA. Nothing tangible that placed Byron at the scene of the crime as the shooter. But as the trial unfolded, the prosecution's narrative began to resonate. They leaned heavily into the character of Byron Case. He was painted as arrogant, rebellious, even menacing at times. To the jury, it may have seemed like he was the kind of person who could do something so terrible. Prosecutors argued that Byron's disdain for authority and his troubled demeanor were glimpses into a darker personality, one capable of killing a friend without remorse. For Anastasia's family, watching the defense pick apart Kelly's story was agonizing. They were forced to endure the suggestion that perhaps Justin Bruton, who had killed himself hours after Anastasia's body was discovered, was the real culprit. This theory had floated around from the beginning, and some in the courtroom still whispered it as a possibility. But prosecutors dismissed the idea, insisting that the evidence, slim as it was, pointed directly to Byron. After days of testimony, cross-examinations, and arguments, the case was handed to the jury. Hours felt like days as everyone waited for a verdict. Then, on May 2nd, 2002, the jury returned. Byron Case was found guilty of first-degree murder. The words hung in the air, final and heavy. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Anastasia's family, there was relief, a sense that justice had finally been served. Their daughter's killer, they believed, had been held accountable. But even in that relief, there was no joy. No sentence could bring Anastasia back. No courtroom victory could fill the hole her death had left in their lives. For Byron Case, the verdict marked the beginning of a different story, a life lived behind bars, and a fight that in the years to come would take on a life of its own. From the moment the sentence was handed down, Byron maintained his innocence. He insisted that the state had built its entire case on the shaky foundation of a single witness, his ex-girlfriend, and that the conviction was a miscarriage of justice. Over the years, his supporters would echo his cries, pointing to flaws in the case, gaps in the evidence, and questions that remained unanswered. One of the loudest concerns raised by supporters was the issue of Justin Bruton's suicide. If Justin had indeed been the one responsible for Anastasia's death, then his decision to take his own life shortly afterward could have been an act of guilt. Why, they asked, wasn't this possibility more fully explored by investigators and prosecutors? Was it easier to pin the crime on Byron years later, when the pressure to close the case had not yet faded? The Free Byron Case campaign began to emerge online, fueled by activists, true crime enthusiasts, and those convinced that Byron had been wrongfully convicted. They pointed to court documents, trial transcripts, and inconsistencies in Kelly Moffat's accounts as evidence that justice had not truly been served. To them, Byron was another victim in this tragic story, a young man condemned to die in prison for a crime he did not commit. Meanwhile, Byron himself became a writer behind bars. His essays and blog posts began circulating online, giving the public a direct window into his thoughts, his frustrations, and his unyielding claim of innocence. He wrote with sharp wit and cutting intelligence, earning a following among those who saw him as more than the caricature painted in court. To them, he was a symbol of how easily justice could go wrong. But for Anastasia's family, these campaigns were a painful reopening of wounds. To them, the jury had spoken, the trial had been fair, and the man convicted of killing their daughter was exactly where he belonged. Every argument for Byron's innocence felt like an erasure of Anastasia's memory, a denial of the justice they had fought so hard to achieve. The debate over Byron Case's guilt has never fully quieted. Some believe the trial was solid, that Kelly Moffat's testimony was credible and damning. Others see too many unanswered questions, too much reliance on the word of one witness, too little physical evidence to support such a severe sentence. The truth may forever be tangled in contradictions, locked away with those who lived through that night in 1997. What remains undisputed is the devastation left in the wake of Anastasia's death. She was just 18 years old, her life cut short before it had truly begun. Her parents lost a daughter, her friends lost a companion. The world lost the potential of everything she could have become. Nearly 3 decades later, Anastasia's story continues to haunt. True crime podcasts, investigative articles, and online forums revisit the case, debating the same questions that plagued investigators all those years ago. Who really pulled the trigger that night? Was justice served? Or does the truth remain buried beneath layers of flawed memory, lost evidence, and human error? At Lincoln Cemetery, where Anastasia's body was found, the grass grows tall in the summer, and the cold winds sweep across the grounds in the fall. For visitors, it is a place of sorrow, but also a reminder of how fragile life can be, a reminder of how a single night can alter countless lives forever. The story of Anastasia Wittbolsfeugen is not just about her tragic death. It is also about the complicated pursuit of justice, the fallibility of human memory, and the enduring pain of families who lose their loved ones to violence. It is a case that raises more questions than answers, and one that lingers in the minds of all who hear it. In the end, what remains most important is not the debates, not the controversies, not the campaigns. What remains is Anastasia herself, her life, her laughter, her uniqueness. She is more than a headline, more than a victim, more than a case file. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams and a future, and her story deserves to be told again and again until her memory is honored, not by arguments, but by remembrance.